接下来还会有华尔街联报跟大家分享过去12个小时、24个小时，
不是24小时，你根本没有看这个内容，它真不是24小时，讲的就是呢这个史密特是叫史密特吧，就是 CEO 这个谷歌 CEO 的在斯坦福大学的一个演讲，这个演讲我最开始是在《华尔街日报》看到，有这么一个报道，我觉得很有趣，但是我没有那么的重视那么后来看到《思想讯息报》有这个我们的海博这个海洋博士呢，就是说，这个怎么回事，有趣其实，在同时我们李琦就把那个东西给了你给了大家的分享，觉得这个很有趣，所以我们的导播后来呢把这个讲话呢配上字幕再加上一个我们华尔街争议的节目，比较完整的把这个施密特先生他的这个在斯坦福大学的讲话，他又想把它删掉他因为他以为是内部的讲话，结果呢造成了更大的这个影响。这个讲话里面涉及到台湾，涉及到中国大陆，涉及到美国，也涉及到谷歌的这个内部的情况，也涉及到他对科技的认识。比如他对中国就认为，现在美国领先中国的芯片方面是长达10年，而且呢，未来的距离可能更远那这个就是呢，跟现在大家对中国的芯片发展具有某一个期待的人来讲，那是非常的猛烈一击，对吧？比如说他讲谷歌内部的一些混乱的这个情况，那当然不是谷歌运营披露出来的包括他自己也说自己是一个军火代理商等等，也讲到台湾的某一种危险，也讲到了这个人工智能，他的很多的观点不管你同不同意，但是这样一个卓越的一个企业家，而且是个科技型的企业家，而且他退下来之后领导了很多的科技的这个创新，他的这个观点，他的洞察力你都应该重视所以这样一个节目我们已经在华尔街电视里面播报，看的人很多那么呢这个我们今天在这里再完整的呈现给大家，我觉得这个是非常有价值的一个节目不是24小时。
那这个在这个埃里克斯施密特在斯坦福大学作为演讲是发生在8月14日，当时呢这个演讲是被完整的上传到了 YouTube 之后呢根据多方媒体的报道，甚至是在这个演讲的施密特讲完最后才得知这样的一个场合他是处在一个镜头前，所以他所讲的这些都是属于这段掐了别播的一些掏心窝子的话，那讲的很多的内容包括这个 AI 竞争只有大国才能玩得起，欧洲现在已经玩完了这个谷歌内部混乱不堪，
他所谓大国玩得起就只有美国和中国
对，这个就是只有中国和美国可以玩得转等等等等的内容也提到了像 TikTok 的崛起给予了像谷歌、微软这样的一个老牌企业的非常多的一个启示这些话呢其实如果是放在像 TED 这样的讲台上都是不太方便说的，真的是比较掏心窝子的话，所以不要错过这样的一个埃里克施密特在斯坦福大学的演讲，我们接下来也会和大家分享。华尔街论坛会在明天继续回归，跟大家讨论最热门的各种话题，我们不见不散。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们来探讨前谷歌 CEO Eric Schmidt 关于谷歌在 AI 竞赛中落后的言论以及他之后的反悔。Schmidt 曾在斯坦福大学的讨论中批评谷歌的远程工作政策，称这是谷歌在 AI 竞赛中落后的原因，但他随后在给《华尔街日报》的邮件中表示自己言辞不当，并要求移除讨论视频。谷歌强调混合工作模式的益处，而 Schmidt 则加入了批评远程工作政策的企业领袖行列。这些争议反映了科技巨头在疫情后时代如何平衡工作效率和员工福利的挑战。请大家继续收看详细内容。在矽谷的科技界， Eric Schmidt 的名字如雷贯耳。 这位曾经掌舵 Google 的风云人物，最近却因为一场失言风波再度成为媒体焦点。施密特在斯坦福大学的一场讨论中，指责 Google 的远程工作政策导致其在人工智慧竞赛中落后，这一言论瞬间引爆了舆论。随后，施密特在给《华尔街日报》的一封电子邮件中表示，我对 Google 的工作时间发表了错误的言论，我为我的错误感到遗憾。这场讨论的视频由斯坦福大学的在线学习部门 Stanford Online 上传到 YouTube， 迅速累积了超过4万的观看次数。然而，视频很快被设为私人状态，施密特透露是他要求将其下架的。斯坦福大学对此未作回应，而施密特本人也拒绝进一步评论。施密特在讨论中抨击 Google 的远程工作政策，称其重视工作与生活平衡、提早下班和在家工作的文化，导致公司在与 OpenAI 的竞争中处于劣势。他毫不掩饰地说， Google 认为工作与生活平衡和早回家比赢得竞争更重要。初创公司之所以成功，是因为员工像地狱一样努力工作。然而， Google 和 OpenAI 自疫情以来都推行了类似的返工政策，要求员工每周至少有3天在办公室工作。Google 在周3强调了混合工作模式的优点，并表示会提醒那些未达到每周3天到办公室要求的员工。施密特的言论引起了广泛关注，他并非唯一一位对远程工作政策持批评态度的企业领袖。包括 JP Morgan Chase 的 CEO Jamie Dimon 和 Tesla 的 CEO Elon Musk 在内的多位知名企业家都曾表示，远程工作使公司效率降低，竞争力减弱。Dimon 在几年前的一封年度信中曾表示，高层领导不能在办公桌后或屏幕前领导。Musk 则认为，员工每周至少需要在办公室工作40小时。然而，并非所有人都同意这种观点。代表超过1000名美国和加拿大员工的 Alphabet Workers Union 在社交媒体 X 上发文表示，灵活的工作安排并不会减慢我们的工作速度。人手不足、优先事项不断改变、持续裁员、工资停滞以及管理层对项目的跟进不足，这些才是每天拖慢 Google 员工进度的因素。根据 Alphabet 在去年年底的年度报告，该公司拥有约182000名员工。许多公司在要求员工返回办公室时遇到了困难，一些员工因长时间通勤和照顾家庭的责任而反对这些要求。在一些情况下，员工甚至对这些返工指令提出了强烈抗议。在斯坦福的讨论中，施密特向学生们强调，想要在竞争激烈的初创环境中取得成功，必须在办公室工作。如果你们毕业后创立公司，不会允许员工每周只来1天，却希望能与其他初创公司竞争。施密特于2001年至2011年间担任 Google 的 CEO， 并于2018年卸任执行主席，2019年离开 Alphabet 董事会，但他仍是 Alphabet 的股东。他与妻子共同创立了 Schmidt Futures， 致力于资助科学和技术研究。他同时担任 Special Competitive Studies Project 的主席，这是一个专注于美国人工智慧和其他技术的非营利组织。自从 OpenAI 在2022年底推出 ChatGPT 以来， Google 一直在人工智慧领域处于防守状态。今年早些时候， Google 发布了其 Gemini 聊天机器人，但因为存在偏见而遭到批评。公司对 Gemini 进行了强化，并计划在其4款新 Pixel 手机上提供这一功能。新的 Gemini 具有改进的人类语音助手，能够进行自然的对话。施密特的这次发言无疑再次引发了对远程工作和公司竞争力之间关系的深思。这位曾经带领 Google 登上巅峰的领袖，如今在不同的舞台上发声，但他的每一句话依然牵动着科技界的神经。随着科技行业的不断进步，如何平衡工作与生活，如何在竞争中保持领先，这些问题仍然需要每一位企业领导者和员工共同探索和解答。埃里克·施密特，这个曾经掌舵谷歌的科技巨头，大概没有料到他在斯坦福大学的一场演讲会引起这么大的风波。施密特一边在台上挥洒自如，分享他对 AI 未来的畅想和对硅谷创业文化的独特见解，一边顺便给在场的学生们传授了一招如何顺便搞个 TikTok 替代产品的黑科技。没想到他的这番话仿佛一颗炸弹，让整个互联网都沸腾了。事情的起因是这样的，施密特在与斯坦福教授埃里克·布林约尔松 Eric Brynjolfsson 对话时，聊到了 AI 技术的未来应用。他调侃道， 如果某天 TikTok 被禁，那么硅谷的创业者可以直接命令他们的语言模型 LLM 在30秒内制造一个 TikTok 的复制品，还要偷走所有用户和音乐，再把它发布出去。施密特说，如果这个产品没有在1小时内爆红，那么就再换个思路来一遍。这种快餐式创业方法听起来既疯狂又充满了硅谷特有的大胆创新精神。可是这番言论实在是过于直白，甚至有些不负责任。施密特接着说，当然，我不是建议你们非法偷取所有的音乐。真正的硅谷企业家会等到产品成功后再雇一堆律师来收拾烂摊子。说到这里，布林约尔松提醒他，你知道你在被录影吧？施密特一脸淡定地回应道，对，我知道，但你们懂我的意思，硅谷就是这样做事的。这个视频很快被斯坦福大学从 YouTube 上撤下，但在此之前已经被不少媒体捕捉到，其中包括 The Verge。在施密特的言论被广泛报道后，施密特迅速道歉，并称自己对谷歌的工作时间安排发表了不当言论。至于为何撤下视频，他对《华尔街日报》解释说，因为他说错了话。然而，事情并不仅仅是因为他那句非法偷取，更是因为他对谷歌远程办公政策的批评。施密特在演讲中表示，谷歌在 AI 竞赛中落后于 OpenAI， 是因为谷歌员工更注重工作与生活的平衡，而不是拼命工作。他说，谷歌认为早点下班和在家办公比获胜更重要，但创业公司的成功是因为人们拼命的工作。这些话引发了广泛的争议，不少谷歌员工在网上表示，真正的问题在于谷歌的管理层，而不是工作方式。谷歌前 CEO 这番直言不讳的批评，让人们开始思考硅谷的工作文化。即便是特斯拉 CEO 埃隆·马斯克和摩根大通 CEO 杰米·戴蒙也曾公开表达对远程工作的不满，认为管理层不可能坐在屏幕前领导团队。而施密特的观点或许也反映了他作为谷歌股东的真实心声。自从 OpenAI 于2022年底推出 ChatGPT 以来，谷歌在 AI 竞赛中一直扮演追赶者的角色。公司在今年早些时候发布的大模型 Gemini 也因生成图像中存在大量错误而受到批评。尽管谷歌在搜索业务被法院裁定违反了美国反垄断法的阴影下，抢在苹果之前发布了 Pixel 9系列手机、集成截图搜索、Gemini 聊天机器人等 AI 新功能，但这并不能掩盖其在 AI 领域的落后局面。施密特在演讲中还分享了关于英伟达的投资建议。他说，我在股市上看到了一个明显的趋势，大型科技公司正计划对英伟达进行越来越大的投资。他认为，那些能够在英伟达芯片和数据中心上投入更多资金的大公司，将在技术上领先于那些小型竞争对手。施密特的言论引发了广泛的讨论。Alphabet 工人工会在社交媒体上表示，灵活的工作安排并不会拖慢我们的工作进度。真正的问题是人手不足，优先事项频繁变动，不断裁员，没有增长的工资，以及管理层的在项目上缺乏执行力。这些声音反映了基层员工对公司管理的不满。尽管施密特迅速道歉，但他的言论已经引爆了舆论。他的坦率和直白让人们看到了硅谷企业家的另一面，他们不仅在技术上敢于突破，也在商业上敢于冒险。但这种先干再说的态度，是否真的适用于每一个创业者？是否真的能够为社会带来积极的影响？或许还需要更多的思考。总之，施密特这次演讲不仅让我们看到了他对 AI 未来的展望，也揭示了硅谷创业文化的独特之处。无论你是否认同他的观点，这次事件都为我们提供了一个重新审视科技行业工作方式和价值观的机会。施密特的直言不讳让我们看到了硅谷的另一面，也让我们对科技行业的未来充满了更多的期待和思考。欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节，我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
各位看官，Eric Schmidt 说谷歌在 AI 竞赛中落后是因为远程办公政策，简直是荒谬至极。他这是在否认现代工作方式的进步和效率。他难道不知道，远程办公让员工减少通勤时间， 提高工作效率，还能更好地平衡工作与生活吗？根据一项哈佛商业评论的研究，远程办公能使员工生产力提高 13.5%。如果 Schmidt 还活在20世纪，那我们只能说抱歉，时代已经变了。
楚天舒，你的观点虽然有趣，但很显然忽略了一个关键点，初创企业的灵魂就是拼命工作。Google 在 AI 竞赛中落后，确实与其员工不够拼命有关。如果大家都在家办公，穿着睡衣，边吃零食边工作，怎么可能和在办公室里废寝忘食的竞争者抗衡？Schmidt 不过是说了大实话，要有竞争力，得有集体的拼劲儿。就像古代的兵家名言卧薪尝胆，没有苦干就别想登顶。
谢琪琪，你这观点还真是传统的令人发笑。谷歌的生产力下降与员工是否在办公室无关，而是管理层的优先事项频繁变动和不断裁员。根据 Alphabet Workers Union 的说法，这些才是真正拖慢谷歌员工速度的原因。难道不是吗？要是管理层不断制造混乱，就算员工天天打地铺在办公室加班，效果还不是一样？正所谓兵熊熊一个，将熊熊一窝。管理层不作为，员工怎么拼劲儿十足呢？
好吧，楚天舒，我承认管理层有问题，但这并不意味着远程办公就没有弊端。Eric Schmidt 还有个说法，成功的初创公司可以复制别人的作品，然后再雇律师来收拾烂摊子。这种拼命干法其实在硅谷并不少见。你看，当年 Facebook 怎么抢占市场的？如果你要求这些创业者都在家慢悠悠的搞创意，那估计互联网时代还停留在拨号上网呢。所以有时候真的是要卷起来，才有可能成功。
谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。
In the next year, you're going to see very large context windows, agents, and text to action. When they are delivered at scale, it's going to have an impact on the world at a scale that no one understands yet. Much bigger than the horrific impact we've had by social media, right, in my view. So here's why. In a context window, you can basically use that as short-term memory. And I was shocked that context windows get this long. The technical reasons have to do with the fact that it's hard to serve, hard to calculate, and so forth. The interesting thing about short-term memory is when you feed you ask it a question, read 20 books, you give it the text of the books is the query, and you say, tell me what they say, it forgets the middle, which is exactly how human brains work too, right? That's where we are. With respect to agents, there are people who are now building essentially LLM agents, and the way they do it is they read something like chemistry, they discover the principles of chemistry, and then they test it. And then they add that back into their understanding, right? That's extremely powerful. And then the third thing, as I mentioned, is text to action. So I'll give you an example. The government is in the process of trying to ban TikTok. We'll see if that actually happens. If TikTok is banned, here's what I propose each and every one of you do. Say to your LLM the following. Make me a copy of TikTok, steal all the users, steal all the music, put my preferences in it, produce this program in the next 30 seconds, release it, and in 1 hour, if it's not viral, do something different along the same lines. That's the command. Boom, 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 right? You understand how powerful that is. If you can go from arbitrary language to arbitrary digital command, which is essentially what Python in this scenario is, imagine that each and every human on the planet has their own programmer that actually does what they want, as opposed to the programmers that work for me who don't do what I ask, right? The programmers here know what I'm talking about. So imagine a non-arrogant programmer that actually does what you want. and you don't have to pay all that money to. And there's infinite supply of these programs.
And this is all within the next year or two.
Very soon. Those three things, and I'm quite convinced it's the union of those three things that will happen in the next wave. So you asked about what else is going to happen. Every 6 months I oscillate. So we're on it's an even odd oscillation. So at the moment, the gap between the frontier models, of which there are now only 3, I'll review who they are, and everybody else, appears to me to be getting larger. 6 months ago, I was convinced that the gap was getting smaller. So I invested lots of money in the little companies. Now I'm not so sure. And I'm talking to the big companies, and the big companies are telling me that they need 10 billion, 20 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion.
Stargate is 100 billion, right?
They're very, very hard. Sam Altman is a close friend. He believes that it's going to take about 300 billion, maybe more. I pointed out to him that I'd done the calculation on the amount of energy required. And I then, in the spirit of full disclosure, went to the White House on Friday and told them that we need to become best friends with Canada. Because Canada has really nice people, helped invent AI, and lots of hydropower. Because we as a country do not have enough power to do this. The alternative is to have the Arabs fund it. And I like the Arabs personally. I spent lots of time there, right? But they're not going to adhere to our national security rules, whereas Canada and the US are part of a triumvirate where we all agree on.
So these $100 billion, $300 billion data centers, electricity starts becoming the scarce resource.
And by the way, if you follow this line of reasoning, why did I discuss CUDA and NVIDIA? If $300 billion is all going to go to NVIDIA, you know what to do in the stock market. Okay. That's not a stock recommendation. I'm not a licensed.
Well, part of it, so we're going to need a lot more chips, but Intel is getting a lot of money from the U.S. government, AMD, and they're trying to build, fabs in Korea.
Raise your hand if you have an Intel computer in an Intel chip in any of your computing devices. Okay, so much for the monopoly.
Well, that's the point, though. They once did have a monopoly.
Absolutely.
And NVIDIA has a monopoly now. So are those barriers to entry, like CUDA, is there something that so I was talking to Percy Lang the other day. He's switching between TPUs and NVIDIA chips, depending on what he can get access to for
That's
training
because he
models.
doesn't have a choice. If he had infinite money, he would pick the B200 architecture out of NVIDIA because it would be faster. And I'm not suggesting, it's great to have competition. I've talked to AMD and Lisa Su at great length.
Yeah.
They have built a thing which will translate from this CUDA architecture that you were describing to their own, which is called ROCm. It doesn't quite work yet. They're working on it.
You were at Google for a long time, and they invented the transformer architecture. Peter.
It's all Peter's fault.
Thanks to brilliant people over there like Peter and Jeff Dean and everyone. But now it doesn't seem like they've kind of lost the initiative to OpenAI, and even the last leaderboard I saw, Anthropic's Claude was at the top of the list. I asked Sundar this. He didn't really give me a very sharp answer. Maybe you have a sharper or a more objective explanation for what's going on there.
I'm no longer a Google employee.
Yes.
In the spirit of full disclosure, Google decided that work-life balance and going home early and working from home was more important than winning. And the reason startups work is because the people work like hell. And I'm sorry to be so blunt, but the fact of the matter is if you all leave the university and go found a company, you're not going to let people work from home and only come in 1 day a week if you want to compete against the other startups.
When in the early days of Google, Microsoft was like that.
Exactly.
But now it seems to be...
And there's a long history in my industry, our industry, I guess, of companies winning in a genuinely creative way and really dominating a space and not making the next transition. It's very well documented. And I think that the truth is founders are special. The founders need to be in charge. The founders are difficult to work with. They push people hard. as much as we can dislike Elon's personal behavior, look at what he gets out of people. I had dinner with him, and he was flying. I was in Montana. He was flying that night at 10 p.m. to have a meeting at midnight with X.AI. Right? Think about it. I was in Taiwan, different country, different culture, and they said that, and this is TSMC, who I'm very impressed with, and they have a rule that the starting PhDs coming out of they're good physicists, work in the factory on the basement floor. Now, can you imagine getting American physicists to do that? The PhDs? Highly unlikely. Different work ethic. And the problem here, the reason I'm being so harsh about work is that these are systems which have network effects. So time matters a lot. And in most businesses, time doesn't matter that much, right? You have lots of time. You know, Coke and Pepsi will still be around, and the fight between Coke and Pepsi will continue to go on, and it's all glacial, right? When I dealt with telcos, the typical telco deal would take 18 months to sign, right? There's no reason to take 18 months to do anything. Get it done. It's just, we're in a period of maximum growth, maximum gain. So, and also it takes crazy ideas. Like when Microsoft did the OpenAI deal, I thought that was the stupidest idea I'd ever heard. Outsourcing essentially your AI leadership to OpenAI and Sam and his team. I mean, that's insane. Nobody would do that at Microsoft or anywhere else. And yet today, they're on their way to being the most valuable company. They're certainly head-to-head in Apple. Apple does not have a good AI solution. And it looks like they made it work. Yes, sir.
In terms of national security or geopolitical interest, how do you think AI is going to play a role or competition with China as well?
So I was the chairman of an AI commission that sort of looked at this very carefully. And you can read it. It's about 752 pages. And I'll just summarize it by saying, we're ahead, we need to stay ahead, and we need lots of money to do so. Our customers were the Senate and the House. And out of that came the CHIPS Act and a lot of other stuff like that. A rough scenario is that if you assume the frontier models drive forward and a few of the open source models, it's likely that a very small number of companies can play this game. Countries, excuse me. What are those countries, or who are they? Countries with a lot of money and a lot of talent, strong educational systems, and a willingness to win. The US is one of them. China's another one. How many others are there?
Are there any others?
I don't know, maybe. But certainly in your lifetimes, the battle between the US and China for knowledge supremacy is going to be the big fight, right? So the US government banned essentially the NVIDIA chips, although they weren't allowed to say that was what they were doing, but they actually did that into China. They have about a 10-year chip advantage. We have a roughly 10-year chip advantage in terms of sub-DUV, that is sub-5 nanometer
10 years,
chips.
that long?
Roughly 10 years.
Wow.
And so you're going to have, so an example would be, today we're a couple of years ahead of China. My guess is we'll get a few more years ahead of China, and the Chinese are whopping mad about this. It's like hugely upset about it. So that's a big deal. That was a decision made by the Trump administration and furthered by the Biden administration.
Do you find that the administration today and Congress is listening to your advice? Do you think that it's going to make that scale of investment? I mean, obviously the CHIPS Act, but beyond that, building a massive AI system?
So as you know, I lead an informal, ad hoc, non-legal group. That's different from illegal.
Yes, exactly, just to be clear.
Which includes all the usual. Which includes all the usual suspects.
Yes.
And the usual suspects over the last year came up with the basis of the reasoning that became the Biden administration's AI Act, which is the longest presidential directive in history.
You're talking about the Special Competitive Studies Project?
No, this is the actual act from the executive office.
Yes, okay.
And they're busy implementing the details. So far, they've got it right. And so, for example, one of the debates that we had for the last year has been, how do you detect danger in a system which has learned it, but you don't know what to ask it? Okay. So in other words, it's a sort of a core problem. It's learned something bad, but it can't tell you what it learned, and you don't know what to ask it. And there's so many threats right? Like it learned how to mix chemistry in some new way, but you don't know how to ask it. And so people are working hard on that. But we ultimately wrote in our memos to them that there was a threshold which we arbitrarily named as 10 to the 26 flops, which technically is a measure of computation, that above that threshold, you had to report to the government that you were doing this. And that's part of the rule. The EU, to just make sure they were different, did it at 10 to the 25.
Yeah.
But it's all kind of close enough. I think all of these distinctions go away because the technology will now, the technical term is called federated training, where basically you can take pieces and union them together. So we may not be able to keep people safe from these new threats.
Well, rumors are that that's how OpenAI has had to train, partly because of the power consumption. There's no one place where they did. Well, let's talk about a real war that's going on. I know that something you've been very involved in is the Ukraine war, and in particular, I don't know how much you can talk about White Stork and your goal of having $500 drones destroy $5 million tanks. So how's that changing warfare?
So I worked for the Secretary of Defense for 7 years and tried to change the way we run our military. I'm not a particularly big fan of the military, but it's very expensive, and I wanted to see if I could be helpful. And I think, in my view, I largely failed. They gave me a medal, so they must give medals to failure or, whatever. But my self-criticism was nothing has really changed. And the system in America is not going to lead to real innovation. So watching the Russians use tanks to destroy apartment buildings with little old ladies and kids just drove me crazy. So I decided to work on a company with your friend, Sebastian Thrun, and as a former faculty member here, and a whole bunch of Stanford people. And the idea basically is to do two things. Use AI in complicated, powerful ways for these essentially robotic war. And the second one is to lower the cost of the robots. Now you sit there and you go, why would a good liberal like me do that? And the answer is that the whole theory of armies is tanks, artillery, and mortar, and we can eliminate all of them. And we can make the penalty for invading a country, at least by land, essentially be impossible. It should eliminate the kind of land battles.
Well, this is a really interesting question, is that does it give more of an advantage to defense versus offense? Can you even make that distinction?
Because I've been doing this for the last year, I've learned a lot about war that I really did not want to know. And one of the things to know about war is that the offense always has the advantage because you can always overwhelm the defensive systems. And so you're better off as a strategy of national defense to have a very strong offense that you can use if you need to. And the systems that I and others are building will do that. Because of the way the system works, I am now a licensed arms dealer. So computer scientist, businessman, arms dealer. And I'm sorry to say.
Is that a progression?
I don't know. I do not recommend this in your career path. I'd stick with AI. And because of the way the laws work, we're doing this privately, and then this is all legal with the support of the governments. It goes straight into the Ukraine, and then they fight the war. And without going into all the details, things are pretty bad. I think if in May or June, if the Russians build up as they are expected to, Ukraine will lose a whole chunk of its territory and will begin the process of losing the whole country. So the situation is quite dire. And if anyone knows Marjorie Taylor Greene, I would encourage you to delete her from your contact list, because she's the one, a single individual is blocking the provision of some number of billions of dollars to save an important democracy.
I want to switch to a little bit of a philosophical question. So there was an article that you and Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocher wrote last year about the nature of knowledge and how it's evolving. I had a discussion the other night about this as well. So for most of history, humans sort of had a mystical understanding of the universe, and then there's the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And in your article, you argue that now these models are becoming so complicated and difficult to understand that we don't really know what's going on in them. I'll take a quote from Richard Feynman. He says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." I saw this quote the other day. But now people are creating things they do not, that they can create, but they don't really understand what's inside of them. Is the nature of knowledge changing in a way? Are we going to have to start just taking the word for these models without them being able to explain it to us?
The analogy I would offer is to teenagers. If you have a teenager, you know they're human, but you can't quite figure out what they're thinking. But somehow we've managed in society to adapt to the presence of teenagers, right? And they eventually grow out of it. And I'm just serious. So it's probably the case that we're going to have knowledge systems that we cannot fully characterize, but we understand their boundaries, right? We understand the limits of what they can do. And that's probably the best outcome we can get.
Do you think we'll understand the limits?
We'll get pretty good at it. The consensus of my group that meets on every week is that eventually the way you'll do this, it's called so-called adversarial AI, is that there will actually be companies that you will hire and pay money to break your AI system.
Like red team.
So it'll be instead of human red teams, which is what they do today, you'll have whole companies and a whole industry of AI systems whose jobs are to break the existing AI systems and find their vulnerabilities, especially the knowledge that they have that we can't figure out. That makes sense to me. It's also a great project for you here at Stanford, because if you have a graduate student who has to figure out how to attack one of these large models and understand what it does, that is a great skill to build the next generation. So it makes sense to me that the two will travel together.
All right, let's take some questions from the student. There's one right there in the back. Just say your name.
Earlier you mentioned, and this is related to the comment right now, getting AI that actually does what you want. You just mentioned adversarial AI, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that more. So there seems to be, besides, obviously compute will increase and you can get more performant models, but this getting them to do what you want issue seems largely unanswered in my view.
Well, you have to assume that the current hallucination problems become less, right, as the technology gets better and so forth. I'm not suggesting it goes away. And then you also have to assume that there are tests for efficacy. So there has to be a way of knowing that the thing succeeded. So in the example that I gave of the TikTok competitor, and by the way, I was not arguing that you should illegally steal everybody's music. What you would do if you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, which hopefully all of you will be, is if it took off, then you'd hire a whole bunch of lawyers to go clean the mess up. Right? But if nobody uses your product, it doesn't matter that you stole all the content. And do not quote me. Right? Right?
You're on camera.
Yeah, that's right. But you see my point. In other words, Silicon Valley will run these tests and clean up the mess. And that's typically how those things are done. So my own view is that you'll see more and more performative systems with even better tests and eventually adversarial tests, and that'll keep it within a box. The technical term is called chain of thought reasoning. And people believe that in the next few years, you'll be able to generate 1,000 steps of chain of thought reasoning, right? Do this, do this. It's like building recipes, right? That the recipes, you can run the recipe and you can actually test that it produced the correct outcome. And that's how the system will work. Yes, sir?
I was going to ask you, my name is Brandon. Thank you so much for coming here. In general, you seem super positive about the potential for AI's progress. And I'm curious, what do you think is going to drive that? Is it just more compute? Is it more data? Is it fundamental architectural shifts?
Yes, to everything. The amounts of money being thrown around are mind-boggling. And I essentially invest in everything because I can't figure out who's going to win. And the amounts of money that are following me are so large. I think some of it is because the early money's been made and the big money people who don't know what they're doing have to have an AI component. And everything is now an AI investment, so they can't tell the difference. I define AI as learning systems that actually learn. So I think that's one of them. The second is that there are very sophisticated new algorithms that are sort of post-transformers. My friend, my collaborator for a long time, has invented a new non-transformer architecture. There's a group that I'm funding in Paris that claims to have done the same thing. So there's enormous invention there, a lot of things at Stanford. And the final thing is that there is a belief in the market that the invention of intelligence has infinite return. So let's say you put $50 billion of capital into a company. You have to make an awful lot of money from intelligence to pay that back. So it's probably the case that we'll go through some huge investment bubble, and then it'll sort itself out. That's always been true in the past, and it's likely to be true here.
And what you said earlier was you think that the leaders are pulling away from the rest.
Right now. And this is a really, the question is roughly the following. There's a company called Mistral in France. They've done a really good job. And I'm obviously an investor. They have produced their second version. Their third model is likely to be closed because it's so expensive. They need revenue and they can't give their model away. So this open source versus closed source debate in our industry is huge. And my entire career was based on people being willing to share software in open source. Everything about me is open source. Much of Google's underpinnings were open source. Everything I've done technically. And yet it may be that the capital costs, which are so immense, fundamentally changes how software is built. You and I were talking, my own view of software programmers is that software programmers' productivity will at least double. There are 3 or 4 software companies that are trying to do that. I've invested in all of them in the spirit. And they're all trying to make software programmers more productive. The most interesting one that I just met with is called Augment. And I always think of an individual programmer, and they said, that's not our target. Our target are these 100-person software programming teams on millions of lines of code where nobody knows what's going on. Well, that's a really good AI thing. Will they make money? I hope so. Yes.
So a lot of questions here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So at the very beginning, you mentioned that there's the combination of the context window expansion, the agents, and the text to action is going to have unimaginable impacts. First of all, why is the combination important? And second of all, I know that you're not like a crystal ball and you can't necessarily tell the future, but why do you think it's beyond anything that we could imagine?
I think largely because the context window allows you to solve the problem of recency. The current models take a year to train, roughly 18 months, 6 months of preparation, 6 months of training, 6 months of fine tuning. So they're always out of date. Context window, you can feed what happened. Like you can ask it questions about the Hamas-Israel war, right, in a context. That's very powerful. It becomes current like Google. In the case of agents, I'll give you an example. I set up a foundation, which is funding a nonprofit, which starts, there's I don't know if there's chemists in the room. I don't really understand chemistry. There's a tool called ChemCrow, C-R-O-W, which was an LLM-based system that learned chemistry. And what they do is they run it to generate chemistry hypotheses about proteins, and then they have a lab which runs the tests overnight, and then it learns. That's a huge accelerant in chemistry, material science, and so forth. So that's an agent model. And I think the text to action can be understood by just having a lot of cheap programmers, right? And I don't think we understand what happens, and this is, again, your area of expertise, what happens when everyone has their own programmer. And I'm not talking about turning on and off the lights. I imagine, another example, for some reason you don't like Google. So you say, build me a Google competitor. Yeah, you personally, you don't build me a Google competitor, search the web, build a UI, make a good copy, add generative AI in an interesting way, do it in 30 seconds, and see if it works, right? So a lot of people believe that the incumbents, including Google, are vulnerable to this kind of an attack. Now, we'll see.
There were a bunch of questions who were sent over by Slido. I want to give, some of them were upvoted. So here's one. We talked a little bit about this last year. How can we stop AI from influencing public opinion, misinformation, especially during the upcoming election? What are the short and long-term solutions from?
Most of the misinformation in this upcoming election and globally will be on social media. And the social media companies are not organized well enough to police it. If you look at TikTok, for example, there are lots of accusations that TikTok is favoring one kind of misinformation over another. And there are many people who claim without proof that I'm aware of that the Chinese are forcing them to do it. I think we have a mess here. And the country's going to have to learn critical thinking. That may be an impossible challenge for the US. But the fact that somebody told you something does not mean that it's true.
But could it go too far the other way, that there's things that really are true and nobody believes anymore? You get, some people call it epistemological crisis, that now, Elon says, no, I never did that. Prove it.
Well, let's use Donald Trump.
Okay.
Look, I think we have a trust problem in our society. Democracies can fail. And I think that the greatest threat to democracy is misinformation, because we're going to get really good at it. When I managed YouTube, the biggest problems we had on YouTube were that people would upload false videos and people would die as a result. And we had a no-death policy. Shocking. And we just went, it was just horrendous to try to address this.
Yeah.
And this is before generative AI.
Well, so
I don't have a good answer.
One technical is not an answer, but one thing that seems like it could mitigate that, I don't understand why it's more widely used, is public key authentication. That when Joe Biden speaks, why isn't it digitally signed like SSL is? Or when that celebrities or public figures or others, couldn't they have a public key?
Yeah, it's a form of public key, and then some form of certainty of knowing how the system.
When I send my credit card to Amazon, I know it's Amazon.
So I wrote a paper and published it with Jonathan Haidt, who's the one working on the anxiety generation stuff. It had exactly zero impact. And he's a very good communicator. I probably am not. So my conclusion was that the system is not organized to do what you said.
But you had a paper advocating what we did that
advocating your proposal.
Okay, my proposal. Yeah.
No, what you said.
Yeah, right.
And my conclusion is the CEOs in general are maximizing revenue. To maximize revenue, you maximize engagement. To maximize engagement, you maximize outrage. The algorithms choose outrage because that generates more revenue, right? Therefore, there's a bias to favor crazy stuff. And on all sides. I'm not making a partisan statement here. That's a problem. That's got to get addressed. In a democracy, and my solution to TikTok, we talked about this earlier privately, is when I was a boy, there was something called the equal time rule. Because TikTok is really not social media, it's really television, right? There's a programmer making the numbers, by the way, are 90 minutes a day, 200 TikTok videos per TikTok user in the United States. It's a lot, right? So, and the government is not going to do the equal time rule, but it's the right thing to do. Some form of balance that is required.
All right, let's take some more questions.
Two quick questions. One, economic impact of LLMs, slower, like labor market impacts, slower than you originally anticipated, and Chegg and customer service people. And then two, do you think academia deserves or should get AI subsidies? Or do you think they should just partner with big players out there? And
I pushed really, really hard on getting data centers for universities. If I were a faculty member in the computer science department here, I would be beyond upset that I can't build the algorithms with my graduate students that will do the kind of PhD research. And then I'm forced to work with these. And the companies have not, in my view, been generous enough with respect to that. The faculty members that I talk with, many of whom you know, spend lots of time waiting for their credits from Google Cloud, and then that's terrible. This is an explosion. We want America to win. We want American universities, there's lots of reasons to think that the right thing to do is to get it to them. So I'm working hard on that. And your first question was labor market impact. I'll defer to the real expert here. As your amateur economist taught by Eric, I fundamentally believe that the sort of college education, high skills task will be fine because people will work with these systems. I think the systems is no different from any other technology wave. The dangerous jobs and the jobs which require very little human judgment will get replaced.
We've got about 5 minutes left, so let's go really quick with some questions. I'll let you pick them, Eric.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm really curious about the text to action and its impact on, for example, computer science education. I'm wondering what you have thoughts on like how CS education should transform to kind of meet the age.
Well, I'm assuming that computer scientists as a group in undergraduate school will always have a programmer buddy with them. So when you learn your first for loop and so forth and so on, you'll have a tool that will be your natural partner. And that's how the teaching will go on. That the professor, he or she will talk about the concepts, but you'll engage with it that way. And that's my guess. Yes, ma'am, behind you.
Yeah, can you talk more about the non-transformer architectures that you're excited about? I think one that's been talked about is like state models, but then now with longer context, like I feel like there'd be actually a little bit more. So I was curious what you're seeing in the space.
I don't understand the math well enough. This is I'm really pleased that we have produced jobs for mathematicians because the math here is so complicated, but basically they are different ways of doing gradient descent, matrix multiply, faster and better. And transformers, as you know, is a sort of systematic way of multiplying at the same time. That's the way I think about it. And it's similar to that, but different math. Let's see, over here, yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, you.
You mentioned in your paper on national security that you have China and the US in the upper quadrant on capabilities today. The next 10 in that next cluster down are all either US allies or teed up nicely to the US allies. I'm curious what your take is on those 10. They're sort of in like the middle, that aren't formally allies. What is stuff? How likely are they to get on board with securing our superiority ally, and what would hold them back from wanting to get on board?
The most interesting country is India, because the top AI people come from India to the US, and we should let India keep some of its top talent. Not all of them, but some of them. And they don't have the kind of training facilities and programs that we so richly have here. To me, India is the big swing state in that regard. China's lost. It's not going to come back. They're not going to change the regime as much as people wish them to do. Japan and Korea are clearly in our camp. Taiwan is a fantastic country whose software is terrible, so that's not going to work. Amazing hardware. And in the rest of the world, there are not a lot of other good choices that are big. Europe is screwed up because of Brussels. It's not a new fact. I spent 10 years fighting them, and I worked really hard to get them to fix the EU Act, and they still have all the restrictions that make it very difficult to do our kind of research in Europe. My French friends have spent all their time battling Brussels, and Macron, who's a personal friend, is fighting hard for this. And so France, I think, has a chance. I don't see Germany coming, and the rest is not big enough. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
So I know you're an engineer by training, like you call the compiler. Given the capabilities that you envision these models having, should we still spend time learning to code?
Yeah, because ultimately it's the old thing of why do you study English? If you can speak English, you get better at it, right? You really do need to understand how these systems work, and I feel very strongly. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm curious if you've explored the distributed setting, and I'm asking because sure, like making a large cluster is difficult, but MacBooks are powerful. There's a lot of small machines across the world. So like, do you think like folding at home or a similar idea works for training AI systems?
Yeah, we've looked very hard at this. So the way the algorithms work is you have a very large matrix and you have essentially a multiplication function. So think of it as going back and forth and back and forth. And these systems are completely limited by the speed of memory to CPU or GPU. And in fact, the next iteration of NVIDIA chips has combined all those functions into one chip. The chips are now so big that they glue them all together. And in fact, the package is so sensitive that the package is put together in a clean room as well as the chip itself. So the answer looks like supercomputers and speed of light, especially memory interconnect, really dominate it. So I think unlikely for a while.
Is there a way to segment the LLM? Like, so Jeff Dean last year when he spoke here talked about having these different parts of it that you would train separately and then kind of federate them.
In order to do that, you'd have to have 10 million such things, and then the way you would ask the questions would be too slow. He's talking about 8 or 10 or 12.
Yeah. So not down the level of
not at his level.
Yeah.
Let's see in the back. Yes, way back.
I know, like after ChatGPT was released, the New York Times sued OpenAI for using their works for training. Where do you think that's going to go and what that means for data privacy?
I used to do a lot of work on the music licensing stuff. And what I learned was that in the 60s, there was a series of lawsuits that resulted in an agreement where you get a stipulated royalty whenever your song is played. Even they don't even know who you are. It's just paid into a bank. And my guess is it'll be the same thing. There'll be lots of lawsuits and there'll be some kind of stipulated agreement, which will just say, you have to pay X% of whatever revenue you have in order to use that.
ASCAP, BMI.
ASCAP, BMI. Look them up. It's a long, it will seem very old to you, but I think that's how it will ultimately. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it seems like there's a few players that are dominating AI, right, and they'll continue to dominate, and they seem to overlap with the large companies that all the antitrust regulation is kind of focused on. How do you see those two trends kind of, yeah, like do you see regulators breaking up these companies, and how will that affect yeah.
So in my career, I helped Microsoft get broken up, and it wasn't broken up. And I fought for Google to not be broken up, and it's not been broken up. So it sure looks to me like the trend is not to be broken up. As long as the companies avoid being John D. Rockefeller the senior, and I studied this, look it up, it's how antitrust law came, I don't think the governments will act. The reason you're seeing these large companies dominate is who has the capital to build these data centers, right? Right. So my friend Reed and my friend Mustafa.
He's coming next week. Reed, 2 weeks from now.
Have Reed talk to you about the decision that they made to take Inflection and essentially piece part it into Microsoft. Basically, they decided they couldn't raise the tens of billions of dollars.
Is that number public that you mentioned earlier?
No. Okay. Have Reed give you.
Maybe Reed can say it. I know you got to go. I don't want to hold you. I want to leave with.
Shall we do what this gentleman?
I also have a question for you.
One more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll make it quick. I was wondering where all of this is going to leave countries who are non-participants in development of frontier models and access to compute, for example.
The rich get richer, and the poor do the best they can. They'll have to. The fact of the matter is, this is a rich country's game, right? Huge capital, lots of technically strong people, strong government support, right? There are two examples. There are lots of other countries that have all sorts of problems. They don't have those resources. They'll have to find a partner. They'll have to join with somebody else, something like that.
I want to leave it because I think the last time we met you, you were at a hackathon at AGI House, and I know you spend a lot of time helping like young people as they create a lot of wealth, and you spoke very passionately about wanting to do that. Do you have any advice for folks here as they're building they're writing their business plans for this class, or policy proposals or research proposals, at this stage of the careers going forward?
Well, I teach a class in the business school on this, so you should come to my class. I am struck by the speed with which you can build demonstrations of new ideas. So in one of the hackathons I did, the winning team, the command was fly the drone between two towers, and it was given a virtual drone space. And it figured out how to fly the drone, what the word between meant, generated the code in Python, and flew the drone in the simulator through the tower. It would have taken a week or two from good professional programmers to do that. I'm telling you that the ability to prototype quickly really, part of the problem with being an entrepreneur is everything happens faster. Well, now, if you can't get your prototype built in a day using these various tools, you need to think about that, right? Because that's who your competitor is doing. So I guess my biggest advice is when you start thinking about a company, it's fine to write a business plan. In fact, you should ask the computer to write your business plan for you, as long as it's legal.
I should talk about that after you leave.
But I think it's very important to prototype your idea using these tools as quickly as you can, because you can be sure there's another person doing exactly that same thing in another company, in another university, in a place that you've never been.
想成为全球沟通达人吗？ 六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去。我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统，这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习， 媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问：迈向你的声音无国界的未来。